Africa is one of the richest continents on Earth. Gold, oil, diamonds, cocoa, lithium, copper, the list goes on. Yet, Africa remains one of the poorest regions globally. This is the great paradox. So why does Africa export its raw materials for cheap, only to import finished products at much higher prices? Today, we're breaking down the real reasons, the deep history, the global players involved, and what this all means for Africa's future. If you're ready for a real deep dive into African economics, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's start with the staggering wealth. Africa controls a huge share of the world's most valuable resources. Think about this, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire together produce over 70% of the world's cocoa. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone holds over 60% of the world's cobalt, a mineral essential for our phones and electric cars. Then you have massive oil reserves in Nigeria, Angola, and Libya, gold and diamonds from South Africa and Botswana, and now, the new white gold, lithium, found in Zimbabwe and Namibia. The continent is a treasure chest. But the problem is, almost all of these resources leave Africa in their raw, unprocessed form. And to understand why, we have to go back in time. The roots of this issue are deeply embedded in colonial history. When European powers like Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal colonized Africa, they didn't design economies for African prosperity. They designed them for one purpose: to supply raw materials to industries back in Europe. Railways and roads were built specifically to transport goods from mines and plantations straight to the ports. They were not built to connect different regions within Africa or to serve local factories. In fact, local manufacturing was actively discouraged and in some cases, outright banned. It was a simple, extractive model. Cocoa from Ghana was shipped to Europe, rubber from the Congo was processed in Belgium, and oil from Nigeria was refined abroad. Even after most African nations gained independence in the 1950s, 60 seconds, and 70 seconds, this fundamental economic structure never fully changed. The old systems, designed for extraction, remain largely in place. This colonial legacy created a huge hurdle for modern Africa: a severe lack of industrial infrastructure. Processing raw materials isn't simple. It requires massive, reliable power grids, sophisticated refineries and factories, a highly skilled workforce, and enormous amounts of capital investment. Many African countries today still struggle with these basics. Frequent power shortages can shut down a factory for hours, making production unpredictable and expensive. Poor transport networks make it difficult to move goods from one part of a country to another, and securing the billions of dollars needed for industrial financing is a monumental challenge for developing economies. When you add all this up, it often becomes cheaper and easier for a country to just export its raw cocoa beans rather than take on the immense cost and risk of building its own chocolate factories from scratch. The path of least resistance has been to keep selling the raw goods. This situation is perfect for large foreign companies. Multinational corporations have long dominated the extraction industries across the continent. You have the oil majors operating in Nigeria and Angola, and the global mining giants controlling the mines in the DR Congo and Zambia. Their business model is straightforward and incredibly profitable for them. They extract the raw resources, ship them out of Africa, process them in their own facilities in Europe, China, or North America, and then often sell the finished products, like gasoline, jewelry, or electronics, back to African consumers at a massive markup. It's a cycle where Africa earns pennies on the dollar for its natural wealth, while others capture the billions in value that come from processing and manufacturing. This dynamic keeps Africa locked in the role of a raw material supplier, not an industrial power. On top of all this, you have global trade rules and international pressure that often work against African industrialization. Many international trade agreements have tariffs that actually penalize processed goods from Africa while favoring raw material exports. So, if an African country tries to export chocolate instead of cocoa beans, it might face higher taxes, making its product less competitive on the global market. Furthermore, loans from institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have historically come with conditions that pushed for privatization and open markets, which sometimes made it easier for foreign companies to control resources and harder for governments to invest in local industries. In some cases, trying to process your own resources locally could even be seen as a violation of certain trade agreements. It's a complex web of global economics that often stacks the deck against Africa. This all comes down to what economists call the value chain problem. Let's use that cocoa example again to make it crystal clear. A farmer in West Africa might sell 1 ton of raw cocoa beans for around $2,500. That sounds like a decent amount, but once those beans are shipped to Europe, processed, and turned into finished chocolate bars, the market value of those products can skyrocket to $40,000 or even more. The vast majority of the profit is made in the processing, branding, and marketing stages, all of which happen outside of Africa. So Africa remains stuck at the very bottom of the value chain, doing the hardest labor for the smallest share of the profits. This isn't just about cocoa. It's the same story for diamonds, oil, cobalt, and countless other resources. So, with all these challenges, is there any hope for change? The answer is yes, but it's happening slowly. We are starting to see some very positive and powerful signs across the continent. In Nigeria, the massive Dangote refinery, one of the largest in the world, is a game changer, aiming to end the country's reliance on imported fuel. In Ghana, the government is making a serious push to process more of its own cocoa locally. On a continental scale, the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA, is working to break down trade barriers between African countries, which could create a huge internal market for African-made products. And countries like Zimbabwe and Namibia are now demanding that lithium mined on their soil must be processed locally before being exported. These are bold, strategic moves. The future will depend on strong leadership, smart policies, and continued investment in Africa by Africa. So, to wrap it all up, the key takeaway is this: Africa is not a poor continent. It is a wealthy continent that has been poorly positioned within the global economic system for centuries. The cycle of exporting raw materials is not an accident. It was designed, but breaking that cycle is the single most important key to unlocking the continent's true potential. Processing African resources in Africa is the pathway to creating millions of jobs, generating sustainable wealth, and achieving true economic independence. This is how Africa moves from being a continent of potential to a continent of prosperity. Thank you so much for watching. If this video gave you a new perspective, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping Africa.